This does not sound like an edible plant. So last night I had Kevin pick me up from the trail and take me into town so I could do some business. I had to sign some documents, get them notarized. Then I just decided to stay in town, shower, clean up a little bit, come back to the trail this morning. Well, this morning I realized I left my trekking poles in Kevin's car. So, hope I don't fall too often. When my sons were out of college and off at their places of work, or maybe even a little before then, I was feeling a lot of pressure from my business and decided that I needed to get away periodically. And I asked my wife's permission if she would mind. She thought that would be a good idea. And so I decided to do a backpacking trip, maybe a weekend or 3 or 4 days. And so I thought I'd do one maybe every season, fall, winter, spring, summer. And so my first trip was in the fall. I went to the Knobstone Trail in southern Indiana. Now for my birthday that year, my wife, in anticipation of my hiking, bought me a set of trekking poles. And I'd never used trekking poles before. I was in the Boy Scouts, I was in the Marine Corps. It was something that I never thought about. I had a walking stick periodically, but never trekking poles. And I didn't know what to make of them, but I thought, well, she went to the effort to buy them, might as well take them. And of course, on that first trip, I took probably about 70 pounds of stuff, half of which I would have never needed on a month-long hike. But I didn't know what I didn't know. And so I had an overly heavy pack, and I took my trekking poles. And when I got out to the Knobstone Trail, being the fall, there were acorns everywhere. It was covered in acorns. In fact, it was like walking on a trail made of marbles. And those trekking poles probably kept me from falling a dozen times. So at this point in my hiking career, I don't go anywhere without trekking poles. Except now, because I left them in Kevin's car. Easter was a few weeks ago, and every time I think of Easter, I think of a story that I tell about my son's birth. And so I think now's an appropriate time to tell that story. Yeah, my son, my oldest son, he's a pastor of a church, has his master's of theology, he loves to play soccer. He's a wonderful human being, one of my heroes. And it always strikes me when I tell this story, because a lot of times I get emotional because I kind of relive it. So when I tell it, don't worry too much about the storyteller. Just think about the story. When my wife and I were expecting our first child, we were having some complications. In the third trimester, she began to hemorrhage some, and we decided we would move in with her parents, because just in case there was a problem and I was still teaching school or coaching and couldn't be reached, at least she would have somebody there to help her out. I would generally go from teaching to coaching, and then I would leave school and I would run by our house and check on everything, and I would probably grab a little bit to eat, and I'd get my clothes for the next day. I would go back to my in-laws' house and I would check on Pam and spend a little time with my family. Then I would start grading essays and student papers, and that would usually take me into midnight or 1 a.m. and then I'd go to bed. Next morning I'd wake up early and shower, change clothes, go to school. It was quite a routine. Pam had taken a leave of absence from her teaching job, so she would spend time just reading and relaxing, and it was kind of driving her a little stir crazy, but the doctors told her to rest and make sure that she didn't do anything really active. So she would spend a lot of time visiting with her folks, and when I got home, she would give me some attention, and it was not a bad time, but we were, worried about the baby because it was our first, and we were concerned. One night, everybody had gone to bed. I was up grading essays like usual, and all of a sudden, from back in the bedroom area, I heard this yell, and it was my wife, and she screamed out, "Mom!" Now, being a husband, I felt a little bit jealous that she didn't scream out my name, but that feeling passed really quickly when we all ran into the bedroom and found her laying in a puddle of blood in her bed. We called the doctor. The doctor said to take her to the emergency room at the hospital, and she would meet us there. And so I gathered up Pam, and we got her into the car. And hospital was about 40 minutes away, so I was driving very quickly. I'm glad there weren't a lot of police on the road at 1 a.m. But I was doing what I could to get her there. And I was worried, and I was praying. And then I looked at the gas gauge. We did not have enough gas to get to the hospital. And so I looked at Pam and I said, we're gonna have to stop at the truck stop up here and get some gas. Well, she looked at me with one of those looks that only a husband can get. Made you very aware of the neon L shining forth from your forehead. But I stopped to get gas, and she was there, and I got out and started to put some gas in the tank, and I was only going to put a couple of gallons in there because that's all we needed. But then I realized, hey, this gas is like 10 cents cheaper every gallon than everywhere else in town. I might be able to fill up and save a couple of bucks. But then I kind of weighed the situation. You know, distressed wife, cheap gas. So I made the decision to go in the direction of my distressed wife, and I only put a couple of gallons in the tank, and we hurried on from there. When we got her to the hospital, they put her in a wheelchair and wheeled her up to the delivery room. The doctor got there and said that we would need to do a cesarean delivery. And so the doctor got Pam ready, and the nurses found me a chair to sit in, and I would just sit there and worry and pray. And so the doctor went to work, and then the doctor said, "Hey, Dad, would you like to see the baby emerge?" And I said, "Oh, yes." And that was a mistake. When our little baby did come, the nurses took him over to the scale. They weighed him, cleaned him up a little bit, and then they wrapped him up and handed him to Pam. And Pam counted his toes and his fingers, and she kissed him. So after letting Pam hold him for a few minutes, the doctor said that she needed to repair the damage from the surgery, so she had the nurses take the baby over to me, and I got to hold him. He was the most precious thing in the world. Truly a gift from God. He even looked a little like me. And it was so cute. With every breath, he would give a little bit of a coo. And I asked the nurse about the breathing, and she said, well, because he was born a little premature, his lungs may not have developed real well. So we're going to keep a real good eye on his blood oxygen level. And if he has trouble breathing, we may have to give him a blood transfusion to help him out a little bit. And that caused me a lot of worry, because this was the early 90s. They didn't know a lot about AIDS, but they did know you could get it from a blood transfusion. And I was scared. So they hooked him up to a monitor. They watched his blood oxygen level. And she said if it went below 90, that they would have to do the blood transfusion. So I just sat there and I watched and I prayed. And the monitor read 96, then 95, then 94. 92. 90. 88. So the nurses came to take him for his transfusion, and I tried to stop him, and I said, look, I donate blood all the time. I'm O positive. Take my blood. And she said, well, no, they don't have enough time to do the tests, and the donors for the neonatal ward have been well tested, and I shouldn't worry because they were very certain that there was not going to be any disease in the blood. But I was worried. And I told her, look, I want him to live. I want him to live with me. I want him to live forever. Take my blood. Take it all. Please. Nurses said no, they didn't have time for testing, and they knew that the people who had donated blood did not have any disease. So they took my son from the room. A short time later, those seemed like days, they brought him back. He had gone from pale to pink, and his breathing was easier. It was as if he had been given new life, as if he had been reborn. And every time I think of that, I thank God for the one who gave his blood so that my son could live. Thanks for listening to my story. I'm here in Death Valley. I'm off the trail for a few weeks, waiting for the snow to melt. But I did want to follow up on one of the stories. I mentioned that the story of my son's birth reminded me of Easter, and I usually don't like to provide any commentary on my own stories, but I didn't want to just let that drop. The reason that story reminds me of Easter is that when Jesus was getting ready to be tortured to death, it was the night before he was going to die, and he knew it was coming. The Bible says he went out into a garden to sleep. It's like they were camping like we do out on the trail. But he and his friends went out, and he asked a couple of his disciples to pray with him, but they fell asleep. But during his prayer, we're told that he prayed, God, let this cup pass from me. And what he meant this cup of suffering. And then eventually we're told that his prayer moved on to, not my will, but yours be done. Now, the Bible tells us that he prayed all night, but I don't think it was some kind of a repeated mantra, let this cup pass from me, not my will, but yours be done. I don't know, the Bible doesn't tell us, but I think that the prayer kind of evolved. I think at some point, Jesus' prayer went from, let this cup pass from me, to something like, God, I love them. I want them to live. I want them to live with me, and I want them to live forever. Take my blood. Take it all. Please. And we can.